In March of 1983, when new wave bands were owning the charts and being plastered all over MTV, the band Quiet Riot released an album that nobody expected would become the number one album in the country, the first heavy metal album to do so. The name of the album was Mental Health, and fueled by the success of their cover of Slade's 1973 anthem, Come On Feel the Noise, Quiet Riot would knock Synchronicity by the Police off the number one spot in the country, where it had been for 17 weeks. All of a sudden, record companies, radio stations, and MTV began paying attention to heavy metal with bands like Motley Crue, Rat, Def Leppard, and then, of course, Guns N' Roses. Between 1986, when Guns N' Roses released their debut album, Appetite for Destruction, until 1991, several waves of pop and glam metal bands emerged from all over the place, but primarily settled in Hollywood. Bands like LA Guns, Poison, Skid Row, Warrant, Cinderella, and dozens of others were soaking things up with big hair, spandex, power ballads, endless guitar solos, dedicated groupies, piles of cocaine, and other excesses. These hair bands, as they would come to be known, sold millions of records until suddenly they didn't. Tom Beaujour is a music journalist that has co-written a brand new book called Nothing But a Good Time, the uncensored history of the 80s hard rock explosion. It's a well-compiled collection of interviews from music insiders that shines a spotlight on a fascinating period in musical history. This is my interview with Tom Beaujour on Baxi's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxi's Musical Podcast.
Hey, how's it going?
Very good. Thanks for taking the time today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I read the book, and I read it very. It's an exhaustive book. It's 500 some odd pages. But
Yes.
what's interesting for me is I was working for an AOR radio station in Milwaukee from 1985 to 1991. So all of this music that's talked about in the book, all these bands, all these personalities that are discussed and mentioned are all bands that I remember playing, and it was like just remarkably nostalgic.
Were they even coming through? They were probably coming through too, right? Were they coming through the station and stuff? Did you meet a lot of them? Or
back then, there was a lot of record promotion. These guys were coming in all the time. They were coming into the station, and I remember. It's funny. It's like the older guys. The Alice Coopers and, the Ronnie James Dios that would come in. At that point in their career, they had kind of settled down and just seemed like your everyday guy. But then you'd have a band of like 18-year-old guys like the guys in Trickster, or who just were just so blown away by the fact that they were at a radio station and being shuffled around from city to city that there was kind of a very naive sense about some of those bands that probably got swept up and signed maybe before they were ready to. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, and I think that it was either that they weren't. I mean, they probably were ready to because they actually ended up selling some records. But I think definitely at that time it was a time where being on a major label was a big deal. Like it was. The way that I like to just think of it is probably interviewing an athlete who just got drafted into like the NFL or the NBA, and
right.
they're in the big show. You know what I mean? And that's what it is to me. It's like these kids, and when you get signed, you're in the big show. You're in the big show,
right?
And you're like, and it's really everything. Suddenly, it's really everything you ever wanted out of life, and you're 20, so like you can drink whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, your body will take it. You know what I mean? It's magical.
Well, it's what's funny is, and the book certainly reflects this. Once you had that door opened, and prior to that, it was impossible to get metal bands played on radio stations, or MTV would barely take notice. But once you had that defining opening moment, it was like a feeding frenzy. I mean, and not so much unlike like the British invasion when the Beatles came out. All of a sudden, every band in in England was being signed to major labels. It's like it was almost like a sense of history repeating itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. One of the things we learned doing the book that I don't think we were fully aware of is like in 1981, 1982, before Quiet Riot breaks out with Come On Feel the Noise, nobody wanted to touch these bands. Like, they were considered to be totally uncool. They were considered to be like holdovers from the 70s, and like what at that time, in 1981, 1980, what labels were signing was, like, we want another Elvis Costello, we want another Knack.
Right.
And that was what was the conveyor belt. And then suddenly, and everyone credits Quiet Riot with this, even Twisted Sister does. That's the one record that got on MTV and all over the radio that blew the whole thing open.
It's interesting that it was that band, because I mean, they had been around, and Twisted Sister to a greater extent had been around for 10, 15 years before that.
Yes.
That happened. It was like, no genre just happens. It develops. And I often wonder, what was it about Quiet Riot that at that very moment made it okay to play?
I think that it was this weird synergy. I think that even though it was a cover of a Slade song, it was an amazing song. And it was a time when MTV MTV was still very hungry for videos. And everybody, especially American bands, were not making videos yet.
Right.
People hadn't figured out yet that it was worth the money to do it. So it was the combination of the song and the fact that MTV just embraced it, and that at the time meant that you were going to be on just every 2 minutes,
Right.
So like these bands suddenly became celebrities. It wasn't just that they were on the radio. They were, Kevin Dubrow, everybody knew his face. The same with Dee Snider. So I think it was a combination of probably this music communicating more with actual like core American kids whose brothers had been into Zeppelin and stuff,
right,
with radio, with sort of this brash look, and then just the MTV thing. Like literally, I think Dee Snider is the one who says it. He's like that basically was like the nitro can, in that when you shoot nitro into an engine of a car,
right?
That it was like that like you would have a song that was doing okay on some regional radio, and suddenly if MTV hit it, it was just like you got blown back in your seat.
What's fascinating is, and I mean, you want to talk about the impact of that song, and a lot, and as I'm reading it, I completely forgot. I mean, I remember the song, I remember the band, but at the time, Synchronicity by the Police had been the #1 album for 17 straight weeks, and Quiet Riot winds up knocking them off that perch. I mean, that's really unfathomable to even think about how powerful that song was at that time.
I think that it was really, I think that America, like sort of, and when I say middle America, I really mean actually anywhere that's not New York or LA, is like a hard rock country. And I think that probably when that came out, it was actually what the kids wanted more so than the Thompson Twins or whatever, whatever. They were just like, oh yeah, this is cool. It rocks hard. I can blast it. Like, it's sort of like there's a adolescent fantasy level to it. I think it had just connected on a level. It just needed to be put in front of their faces. But yeah, it knocked Synchronicity out. I think it was also like, I think that Thriller was, I don't remember what else was up, but like it totally just dominated. And it demonstrated to the record labels that there was money in this, like not a little money, but like that you could top the charts with it, which then Twisted Sister ends up doing, Poison ends up also having multiple, later on in the mid and late 80s, multiple Billboard, top 40 hits, not just like album rock hits, but hits,
right.
And I think that it was just this, you needed that one thing to show the labels that this music that maybe they weren't that interested in, to just ignite it. And then suddenly you've got Rats getting signed, Motley Crue's getting signed, and all these bands had already been putting out independent records and sort of doing it on their own because there was no interest. And then suddenly the labels realized like, oh, you know what? This is a thing.
Right. Well, one of the defining moments of my early radio career, and especially the radio station I was working for at the time, was that you had some of these bands. It took a long time before they would see the light of day at a radio station. Motley Crue would be a perfectly good example. It took Home Sweet Home before radio stations really started to pay attention to these kinds of bands, that it tend to always be about that big ballad. And in reading the book and reading some of the interviews that were in there, it sounded like there was no interest in the record company's part to even release a ballad on a metal record. Like, it was great hesitation, like, well, this couldn't possibly work, and then it wound up being the very
Right.
standard of the entire genre.
I think eventually they figured. One of the people we interviewed in there is a woman named Madeline Scarpula, who was she was radio promotions. She manages Kicks now, but she was radio promotions for Mercury Polygram, and then a product manager. And I think like after Home Sweet Home, they realize they figure out the labels figure out the formula, which is that you release two rockers off a record
Mm-hmm.
to establish the cred of the band and to get MTV going, get core radio going, and then the third single always became the ballad. And with the ballad, you were going for top 40 radio. And so that's part of and what in the end, what undoes this music at the end of the era is that they had become a formula, but that becomes the formula for marketing a glam metal record or whatever you want to refer to it as. Two rockers and then the ballad. And CC DeVille said, with the I think they mentioned in our book, he's like, you get a couple songs out there, you might get a car. The ballad's the one that's going to buy you your house.
And he was right about that, because
He was right.
Yeah, he was absolutely right. One of the things that was really important at the time, it's interesting you bring up someone involved in record promotion, because radio stations were feeling this constantly. When Guns N' Roses released Appetite for Destruction, it took a period of time before it would catch on, and it was like a slow buildup to what would become maybe the most important album of that entire decade, because what radio stations were constantly looking for was the next Guns N' Roses. And I remember program directors coming in and saying, "I've got the brand new gun. I got the next Guns N' Roses record. It's Warrant." Or Tora Tora was one that was being touted as the next Guns N' Roses, and it was like a string of bands that I think we was so desperate for this, once in a generation type of album to come out. You have to wonder, and you do hear about it in the book, about what all these other bands are thinking when all of a sudden there's a monster of an album that everyone has to then be compared to. That had to be a hell of a challenge for a lot of these bands.
I think it was. I think it was a challenge on a lot of levels. First of all, because you really are coming. The thing about Guns N' Roses that define them as much as the music is like there's a real authenticity and danger to them, which you can't manufacture. You can't manufacture the fact that these guys are people. If you probably looked at them the wrong way, would you wouldn't want to get into a bar fight with Guns N' Roses, and those guys were really intense individuals, all five of them. I think that there was a real danger to them that these other bands couldn't live up to. You couldn't be the next Guns N' Roses because you're never going to get Slash and Axl and Izzy and these crazy people all together in one room making this amazing music and sort of pushing this real dangerous threat, energy off of the thing. But I think it also liberated a lot of bands. I think, for example, Tom Kiefer from Cinderella talks about the fact that, he hadn't been particularly comfortable with the glam thing.
Right.
How the band looked on the cover of Night Songs and stuff. And when Guns N' Roses comes out, you see all of the bands change their look, all of the Dayglow stuff and the weird fringe stuff and all that, and that bands were wearing in 83, 84, 85, sort of things that disappears. And everybody suddenly is wearing black jeans or torn jeans and cowboy boots. And it's Guns N' Roses comes in, and not only do they change the music, they change the whole look. And I think for a lot of bands, actually, they were relieved because they were like, great, all I have to do now is wear a T-shirt and some cowboy boots, and like I don't have to, wear all this makeup and stuff. So I think it was liberating in a way as well to bands to just be like, okay, we can go out there and rock. But in terms of competing with Guns N' Roses, that's a tough ticket, man, because you're with the music and the attitude and the personalities, and most bands don't have all of those things.
Well, I think in the minds of fans, they weren't really looking for the next Guns N' Roses, but the record companies and radio stations that were pushing this music were looking for those kinds of things. I mean, I saw Guns N' Roses just a couple of years ago. They were playing in Hartford, Connecticut, and they were great. But I think most fans, they were just interested in what song they enjoyed, or what their girlfriends liked, or what shows they were going to go to. Like a lot of factors that had nothing to do with whether it was played on radio or not.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I think that they were getting, and they were probably the fans of the music were watching Headbangers Ball and, reading the magazines and stuff. So it wasn't all, they were probably getting their information from a lot of places in addition to radio. I think that, the thing with Guns N' Roses and with a couple other bands, like I would say Motley Crue are like this, and, there are other ones, they're just like, you look at those guys and you're like, those guys are cool, and that's, I mean, if you're a 16-year-old kid, that's what it's all about, right? Is like, I want to be that guy. Like, I want to escape my reality and be in that gang, And, but I think that, there was a lot of stuff going on that wasn't, I think it's just easy to say something like that. There are probably also people going around saying, this is the next Poison. And then once Warrant got famous, I'm sure that, like, when you're getting into, like, the third wave of this stuff, there's people signing bands like Tough and being like, this is the next Warrant, So I think that it's always about being able to say something. That's the whole world is predicated on being able to sell something in 5 words or less.
The whole genre and the book really, I think, magnifies this pretty clearly. This really did come in a lot of different waves, and there were some people that were involved early on that maybe got left behind as things started to progress. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of like a band, say like Wasp or Dokken to a certain extent. I mean, George Lynch is a freaking amazing guitar player who may have been every bit as talented as anybody else who's ever played. But you don't hear George Lynch being mentioned all that much by the end of the decade. Like he had almost kind of been, left behind. Randy Rhoads, the respect for that guy was certainly there, but his legacy is partially based on the fact that he didn't survive the decade, but still every bit as talented as anybody else. It's like there were waves that were progressing this thing forward.
I think that George Lynch, I think Dokken were a really great band. They, one of the things that we explore a lot in the book, though, is the fact that like Don Dokken and George Lynch, just their relationship is terrible from day one. Those guys hate each other.
Right.
George Lynch never got over the fact that the band was called Dokken. I don't think George Lynch completely got over the fact that he didn't get the Ozzy Osbourne gig, which we also explore in the book. Like that it was him and Jake E. Lee, and Jake E. Lee got the gig. But I think that to answer your question, I think Dokken, one of the reasons they got left behind is, we were just talking about the chemistry of Guns N' Roses. I don't feel like Dokken really, they were a great band. They played great, but I don't know if they ever put across that sort of very monolithic image. But by the end of the decade, you've got, the thing is that so many amazing guitar players have come up. So you've got George Lynch, but you've also got Nuno Bettencourt and Vito Bratta and Reb Beach. So there's whereas in 1980 on the Sunset Strip, which is really, George Lynch is already there. He's actually already there when Van Halen is on the Strip. So he's like a 70s guy. He's one in a million. But by the time you get to like 1987 or 1988, there are so many amazing guitar players. Probably a lot of them learned to play listening to George Lynch. They bought Tooth and Nail when they're 14 and now they're 19. and they're just like unbelievable. So I think that was part of why he didn't get his due, is that, that so many guys came up.
There was one quote in the book, and I forgot who said it, that you're talking about thousands of bands that were all converging at once, and they're coming from all over the country to be in Los Angeles or Hollywood. There's plenty of guitar players that a lot of flash and not as much substance as some of these other guys. But as you kind of get more repetitive and more self-cannibalizing in the genre, it's like you realize, okay, those guys that were outstanding, the George Lynches, the Warren DeMartinis, I mean, those guys were far ahead of many of these guys. That it was like more image driven than maybe chops.
Absolutely. I mean, and those guys were, I mean, Warren is amazing. That early, those guys were totally amazing. But I do think that a little bit later, I think, there are a lot of bands where the musicianship is not up to snuff. But you do, but someone like a Nuno Betancourt from Extreme or Vito Bratta, there are some other guys who come out who are equally virtuosic. I mean, it was a magical era for the rock guitar.
Yeah.
I mean, there was not another era where like bands were having pop hits with like guys completely just shredding on guitar. But like certainly when the range of musicianship between a guy like a George Lynch and then like somebody, like there were definitely, let's just put it, there were definitely bands where there wasn't that level of musicianship. And so, even we discussed in the book, like, Warrant on their first record, the producer, Beau Hill, he has to he gets in a session guy to play the solos because he's just like, these guys are great. They can play rhythm. They have got great songs, but they're just not cutting it in 1987 or 1988 Guitar God terms.
Right.
So there were bands getting signed definitely that didn't all have the best guitar player in them.
You did have some bands that based on the timing probably should have gotten maybe more respect than they did. And like one of the bands that I remember thinking these songs are great, but they're great just as grunge is coming in. It's like a band like Enough's Enough. They had great songs, but for whatever reason, their timing was just maybe a year or two too far out. I think that ultimately hurt that band because I think they should have been much bigger than they wound up being.
I love that. One of the we actually apologized to, in the back of the book, we have like a list of apologies to people who we interviewed, and we didn't really get to use the interviews just because there was no room and we couldn't figure out how to, and Chib's Enough is one of them. Because I did a 2-hour interview with him, and he was great.
Yeah.
I think that it's true that the timing wasn't good for them. I think one of the more decadent bands of the era, and like they'll admit as much. So I think that they were also, I spoke to Derek Schulman, who was the head of Mercury Records,
yep,
and who signed Bon Jovi and Cinderella, and then he moves to Atco Records, and he signs Pantera and Enough's Enough. And he basically said about Enough's Enough that they kind of like broke his heart a little bit because like he's just like they were just out of control, and like so I think that they were a band that were great, but that were also had their demons. But their songcraft is just amazing. Like New Thing is just like one of the best,
yep,
top 10 songs of the era. And they were great live. They did not get their due. And then it discusses in the book like they also made probably some weird decisions. Like I think that they opened much of Nelson's tour, and like I don't think that the Nelson fans were like really interested in them. So like, if you don't get the right tour and the right thing and the right that, and all
right,
the ducks aren't in a row, then you can miss the wave.
One of the best group of stories surrounding one particular band has to be Great White. The stories
Yes.
of Jack Russell are unbelievable. I mean, I had completely forgotten that he had served time in prison. I had completely forgotten about that.
I mean, our book is all built on quotes, and we tried to keep them all compact so that people are interacting. But there's this story where Jack Russell, we just let him go for like 3 pages because he tells the story of it is the craziest story in the book about being 17 and his sort of like side hustle was that he and his friend would rob drug dealers for their cash, which are in itself seems dangerous. And then he ends up smoking PCP before one of his heists and like blacks out and shoots a maid, and he just got lucky that he didn't kill her. It's the craziest story I think in the whole book. That like, and he tells it in a very matter of fact way. It's like I don't, and then he ends up. I think he served like 6 weeks due to a clerical error. It's completely insane. But yeah, Jack Russell. Yeah, he shot a lady. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's completely. When my co-writer Rich did that interview, and he came back to me and he was like, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe the interview I just did."
I actually had to read it twice because I'm like, really? Did he just say that? Does that exactly?
Yeah.
It was it's an unbelievable story.
I mean, it's like in an unbelievable detail. He's like, and then the lady was behind the door, and I kicked the door down, and I'm on PCP at this point, so like I don't know what I'm doing, right? Like the way he tells it is just. And then I like that at the end of him telling this insane story, he's like, "I'm not trying to condone this, by the way, but like I hope that it will help people. It might help some people to realize, like sort of like the don't do drugs, kids, but it's completely unhinged. I mean, like that's people talk about like Motley Crue being decadent and stuff, but like this is like completely just absolutely next level. I don't even know if it's outrageousness as just much as like just total craziness.
The stories are so bizarre that they almost outdo the Ozzy Osbourne stories. I mean,
yes.
That's how bananas these stories are in the book, because it's like all the things about Ozzy, whether it's snorting ants or doing other things by the pool that just seemed disgusting. Jack Russell takes the cake on those stories.
He absolutely takes the cake. And I will tell you about the Ozzy by the pool thing. There's a part I actually, but our lawyers informed us that we uncovered something about that we were not allowed to print. But let me just say to anyone who's ever heard the story about Ozzy by the pool with Nikki Sixx, it was actually much more disgusting than you've ever heard. And I have to leave it at that. But
okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff in there. And then, a lot of people doing, Dokken having a video cameras in the back lounge of their bus. So like they're filming, band members, having sex with groupies, and like Rat having to get their bus fumigated there because they get crabs in there. Like there's a lot of crazy stuff. And then you also, and the flip side of it is everybody worked really hard.
Oh yeah.
It's funny. There's like both things coexist.
There's a part of the story that's really not covered in the book. And I guess it's from more of a radio perspective, because at the time record companies were having a field day with these kinds of bands, and they were pushing certain bands really, really hard to get played on radio stations. And back then there were a couple of trade publications that, they wanted to see their songs on these charts, and certain radio stations were reporting to these particular trade magazines. And that's how you knew a song was doing really well, by how many radio stations were playing it. But in order to persuade programmers to play those records, there was a lot of sleazy debauchery that went on to promote these particular records. And once the Nirvanas came into light, you stopped seeing it. You stopped seeing it in the same way. It's like the record companies, I don't know if they decided to button up or whether it just didn't seem appropriate for the next wave of music. But I just remember some amazing stories of program directors literally deciding between records based on how much cocaine was provided by what record company. That was
amazing.
That was pretty standard stuff. I also was fascinated by the whole part about Nirvana, and there's a lot of people that will say that Nirvana killed the glam metal or the hair bands or whatever, and the way it was described, and I forgot who exactly said it, but I thought it was really interesting that there were so many different aspects of the demise of this genre. that it cannot just be simply pointed at Nirvana. Although, from my perspective, I mean, I remember the day that my program director handed me that Nirvana record and said, play this song. And it was like, whoa, this suddenly made everything that we had been playing seem kind of silly and dumb. And it was like a really important moment in music and in radio. And I have to assume that for many of the bands that were trying to come across in the next wave, this became a significant obstacle for them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that Nirvana killed hair metal. I think that what you're saying, what you're describing about how when Nirvana came along, it kind of made what you'd been playing seem silly is kind of accurate in that what happened was I think that Nirvana came along at the right time. I think that the glam metal, hair metal, however you want to call it, had been going for about 10 years at that point, and that it was in a very vulnerable state because you had bands copying bands. It had become very formulaic. It had become very over the top. Fred Corey, the drummer from Cinderella, points out in our book that also by that point, Cinderella is making a blues record, and Warrant's like the bands had all started to drift and maybe weren't doing their best work anymore. And I think people were burnt out on it. So I think Nirvana comes along at this, and when you say Nirvana, I mean we're also talking about Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden. All these bands come along at a time where I think things were ready to change anyway.
Yeah.
Right. What was but what's surprising in the book is that all of these bands, you have like Axl Rose invited Nirvana on tour. I saw Alice in Chains open for Extreme. There was a period where these things were sort of coexisting for a while. I think, Skid Row played a Foundations Forum in L.A. with Soundgarden. Like there was lots of crisscrossing of these bands. But then what happens is Nirvana doesn't kill hair metal, but I think that what does happen, which is the unusual thing with this, and you could probably talk to this as someone who was working in radio, the way in which the script flips overnight is something that we haven't seen a lot. Where suddenly, literally, all of these bands are deemed completely uncool. Every producer who worked on that kind of music can't get a job. The way that it was cut off at the knees was very unusual.
I would think that's absolutely true. Very much like the feeding frenzy that had gone on, like in the 3 or 4 years preceding, the release of that record, when record companies were suddenly all about, glam metal. They suddenly all, became about, wearing flannel and smoking clove cigarettes. I mean, it changed because all of a sudden the record company sees the dollar signs in the skies and says, okay, now that's the next thing. I mean, I remember the radio station receiving a Soundgarden record, the one with Outshined on it. And there was no way our station was going to play that. Now, it's a great record, but there was no way they were going to play it. It was like 3 or 4 years too soon. But the moment that Nirvana and Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam come out, all of a sudden, suddenly Soundgarden is valid. And those songs wind up getting played, even though they had been rejected by nearly every program director in America. It's like the flavor of the day has always guided the record companies. And now that things have changed so dramatically, the power of the record company has almost evaporated because of their own arrogance and aggressiveness. I mean, I think the state of music is kind of almost like a self-sabotaging, self-induced phenomenon.
It probably, I probably agree with you about that. And I also think, just to bring it back around, there's one thing that I think is important also to remember in the book is that, we talked to Kim Thale from Soundgarden, and we talked to Jerry Cantrell from Alice in Chains, and both of them are like very emphatic that they're like, dude, we didn't want to kill hair metal. We weren't out to get anybody. Jerry Cantrell says, like, I don't want to be remembered as someone who took somebody else's career away from them. You know,
Yeah.
he's just like, it was like, you know, and I think that there's a lot of, I don't think those bands were out like hostile towards the other bands. I think maybe Kurt Cobain himself, because he was very against sort of the misogyny that was present in some hair metal and some other things like that. I think he was sort of very hostile towards it, but I don't think a lot of the other guys, I think, you know, were just doing their thing. So I don't think that there was there was a plot or some kind of conspiracy. J.J. French from Twisted Sister has a great quote about this in the book, where he's like, conspiracy? There was no conspiracy. He goes, since when is effing people over to try and make a lot of money a conspiracy? You know, it's just like the labels changed, like you said, because they're like, oh, this is where the money is now. Nobody was out to get anyone, I don't think.
But isn't it funny though? Because you know, when the record companies turn their backs on these bands, you know, here you are many years later. All of a sudden, these bands start playing, maybe in smaller venues, maybe not getting, you know, as much, you know, television coverage or whatever it may be, or even radio coverage. But if Poison decided after the pandemic to get together for a tour, it would sell out everywhere it went. And the same thing with Guns N' Roses or you know, Motley Crue. All of these bands still have an enormous fan base that never went anywhere. But it's all the other aspects of that business that maybe decided to marginalize who these bands were.
I think that we were lucky to do this book now. I think if you had, and you have to remember last summer, you know, there was supposed to be a stadium tour that was Poison and Motley Crue and Def Leppard, you know, like they were doing stadiums. You know, these bands are a very big draw still. I think it's come back around. I think in the early mid-90s, you know, the fan base kind of went away. You know, people like Brian Forsyth from Kix and Cher Ross, who's the bass player in Vixen, talk about this in the book, that during that period, even though they were people who had platinum records, like when they were out auditioning for bands, like Brian Forsyth auditions for the Wallflowers, he didn't even mention that he had been in Kix. You know what I mean? Like, it was just such a badge of dishonor to have been in one of these bands, even though you had a platinum record and a number 9 Billboard hit, I think, with Don't Close Your Eyes. But you know, after the 90s and the 2000s, these bands start touring again. And I think people who had grown up on this music were hungry to hear it. Now their kids are into it, you know, and they really are all having sort of a second life. Like you said, you know, it's not on the cover of Rolling Stone, and it's not, you know, in the newspapers or like the coolest thing in the world, or like, you know, but these bands go out and play. They're making a living. A lot of them are making more money than they did back in the day. They go do their weekend shows. The bigger bands like Poison and Motley Crue and Def Leppard can still do, you know, arenas and stadiums. There's a real fan base there, and it has moved. It's not just people in their 50s and, you know, or late 40s or 50s who grew up on it. Now it's their kids.
Yep.
It's, you know, 20-year-olds. It's really has grown a life of its own. I think people kids go on YouTube and look at these videos from the 80s, and they're like, oh my God, it's like superheroes. Because it's like, wow, that was rock and roll back then. Like, oh my God, look at how many people and the stuff blowing up and this pyro and those like, it really was like a magical, you know, sort of like time where these bands were like superheroes. So I think it's inspiring to kids now too.
Some of my best radio stories happened during those years, and you know, when I read the book, it brings me back to that time where probably had more fun during my radio career during these years than at any other time in the next, you know, 35 years. So, I mean, to read the book was a real joy.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you. I'm really glad that people are enjoying it. You know, it took a long time.
Well, and there's a lot of interviews in here, and it's all fascinating to see it from a different kind of perspective. It's really interesting. Nothing but a good time. The uncensored history of the 80s hard rock explosion. Tom Beaujour, it's great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Again, the name of the book is Nothing But a Good Time, The Uncensored History of the 80s Hard Rock Explosion by Tom Beaujour and his co-author, Richard B. Ainstock. If you enjoyed the podcast, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Go email me at bax@rock102.com. Thanks for listening to Baxi's Musical Podcast.